Well, hey guys, how's it going, everyone out there? Welcome to day 31 of our nationwide, that is, worldwide lockdown. Hope you're all doing well, keeping healthy, staying busy, and making the best of this crazy mess that we're all in right now. Well, at the risk of sounding a bit too depressing to start things off, let me guess, but I bet many of you are feeling quite anxious right now. You're tempted to watch the news daily, hourly, and in many cases almost by the second to see if there is any good news possible out there right now. For some of you, you're like me. You're looking at the snow outside right now out this window, and if you live anywhere near where I live, you see not only at least a foot of it still on the ground, but mountains of it in some places. And you're wondering if spring will ever come, if you're going to have enough feed to make it, and if you're ever going to get into the field on time, let alone get last year's crop off the ground. And so, maybe as a result, you're looking at the forecast, not just for today, but you're following like the 7-day, the 14-day, and if possible, you'd be checking the entire summer forecast in order to find some confidence that things are going to work out this summer. Well, for others of you, I know that you're watching your bank accounts more than ever right now, since for some of you this lockdown has taken you away from work, and you are wondering if you're even going to have a job to return to, let alone whether you'll receive that check from Mr. Justin Trudeau. But on top of that, if you were to be brutally honest with me, you'd probably confess that the coronavirus itself is pretty scary business, at least for some. What if it happens to show up in my hometown or your hometown? You, me, others might be in that higher age bracket or have such and such a health condition, and you're wondering, what if I get the virus? Now, at this point, I know what you're thinking. All right, you're like, whoa, Mr. Goulet. I thought you were going to say something helpful and positive about our fears, and not just like skyrocket them through the worst or through the roof or make them even worse by reminding us just how many possible uncertainties there are out there right now. And fair enough. I get that. I understand that. I feel the same. But that was kind of the point. You see, the fact is, fear, worry, and anxiety are really big temptations for many people right now. And why not? It is just a fact that when threats rise, dangers rise, so do the temptations to fear, worry, and become anxious. But let me be honest with you. At one level, that is not necessarily a bad thing. So for today, for this video, let's start right here. Fear, in and of itself, is not necessarily a sin or something to be avoided. You see, in a world where real dangers exist, fear can actually be a very natural function of wise living, depending on what a person does with the sensation or the emotion of fear. When I was a teenager, I dropped out of school and spent much of my latter teen years hitchhiking around Alberta and British Columbia, adventure seeking and living life on the edge. On one of these expeditions, I was in North Vancouver, hiking in the Lynn Canyon Park, and we were making our way up the side of one of these most magnificent waterfalls that place is known for. I remember getting onto the top of where the waterfall was gushing out over the edge to where the cliff was, and wanting to get a closer view, I crept closer and closer to the edge of that cliff, getting out as far as I could possibly get without falling off the edge. And it was at that point, I can remember as clear as yesterday, I was totally overwhelmed by the most powerful, emotional sensation of fear that I can ever remember. And as a result, I jumped back from the edge of the cliff with everything that was in me. Fear saved my life that day. And it was my right response to the sensation of fear which wisely led me to make a reasoned response to the situation I had gotten myself in. Like, what are you doing, you imbecile? Get away from the edge of the cliff. Warning, warning, warning. And it was that strong sensation of warning that saved my life that day. Certainly, ultimately, God saved my life that day, but God uses secondary means. You see, I like to think of the initial sensation of fear as the soul's warning system. The soul's warning system. That, when it is working rightly, is a good and necessary function of living in a fallen world. It is that sensation that grips and alerts you that there is real danger, threat, or trouble ahead. But just like the conscience, fear, a good fear, can become miscalibrated. It can become miscalibrated so that it is actually either dysfunctional or inoperative. That is, it's similar to how the conscience can either be too overly sensitive on one hand, 1 Corinthians 8:12, 1 Corinthians 8 and chapter 12, and Romans 14, or it can be not sensitive enough on the other, maybe even seared so that it's not even working. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2. You see, in my experience at the top of the waterfall, at the edge of the cliff that day, fear for me at that moment was operating correctly. My soul's warning system was doing its job, and I wisely responded to the real threat of falling into that precipice. Now, let's take another instance where, to the contrary, my soul's warning system was actually malfunctioning, or maybe not even operative at all. So, as long as I can remember, I have generally liked heights. No, not the sensation of being on the utter edge of a terribly high cliff, but being up on the roof of a house or a shop and framing a roof package is super fun for me. I like the view from up there, and I feed off the challenge. So, on this particular occasion, I was placing trusses on my house back in Elk Point, Alberta. Each truss was secured at each end with a couple of nails, where it was then tied to the rest of the trusses by about 3 or 4 sets of blocking in between the trusses. And it was that way until we could finally get the plywood on top and get everything tied down and strong and secure. So, the plywood was not on yet. The trusses were still wobbly, and we were doing our framing. And I usually have no problem walking on top of the trusses from truss to truss to get across the roof structure. And I usually feel very comfortable doing so, even though they are a bit wobbly. But on this particular day, things got a little haywire. I had my work belt on with a portable air nailer in my left hand and nothing in my right hand. And so as I was walking from truss to truss up the slope of this house, something happened that led to an injury. My phone rang, and it was on my belt. And I had one hand free, and what did I do? I answered the phone. I picked up the phone, which was attached to my belt, and without any sense of fear, I answered the call. I missed the next truss with my foot and proceeded to fall straight onto one of the trusses with the side of my body, badly bruising my rib section in the process. You see, in this situation, my capacity to fear was actually malfunctioning. In fact, it was not even operable. Like, I felt zero fear going for my phone and picking it up. The moment I experienced a sensation of fear was when I actually hit the top of the trusses and realized that I could fall all the way through to the floor. And that was not a good thing. That was not a good thing that I felt no fear in that moment. What I needed in that moment was a healthy dose of fear acting as my soul's warning system, alerting me to the fact that what I was doing was not only unwise, but flat out reckless. Now, as you well know, the Bible has a lot to say in regard to the topic of fear. At least 93 times in the Bible, the straightforward command to fear not is expressed. And in most of those instances, it is God who is giving the injunction. So fear, in its negative sense, is definitely something that God perceives as sinful. But as I have already hinted at, as we will see, even the Bible itself suggests that the command to not fear or to not be anxious is a bit more complex than just saying all emotional sensations of fear or anxiety are sinful. Not necessarily. Instead, it's what one does with the emotion that can lead to sin, not necessarily the emotion itself. Now, the reason we need to make this distinction right off the bat is because it's not just me making this distinction. The Bible itself seems to suggest this very thing. You see, it is the same person, the Apostle Paul himself, who says in Philippians 4:6, "Do not be anxious about anything, but by prayer and petition and thanksgiving, giving your requests to God, and the God of all peace will comfort you." That same person is the one who also said elsewhere in 2 Corinthians 11 that he himself had anxieties. And so how do we make sense of this? Well, again, 2 Corinthians is a perfect example. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, Paul is listing off the many dangers that he encountered as a follower and minister of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he says it like this, quote, "I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger at sea, in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and I have gone without food. I have been cold and naked, and besides everything else, listen to this, I face daily the pressure of my, what? Anxiety for all the churches." Now, if you're like me, you want to say, "Hey, Paul, did you not just tell the church in Philippi not to be anxious about anything? What are you doing being anxious about the spiritual state of all the churches that you have planted? Aren't you doing the very opposite of what you commanded elsewhere?" And I think his answer would be no. Of course not. Because there is a kind of anxiety that is the legitimate response to a potential danger or threat, right? The cliff experience. Let's call it concern. And then there is a kind of anxiety that must have control, that can't stop thinking about the issue, and that leads to anxious feelings of distress. So what you have in the Bible is a positive use of the word anxiety and a negative use. And this is not the only place where Paul does this. So again, it's helpful to make distinctions here right off the bat as we journey on this series on fear. It's helpful to make distinctions right here and to realize that the Bible does so as well, so that you are not treating something as sinful that the biblical writers or God himself does not consider sinful. So let me sum it up like this. There are two ways to think of fear. Let's call the first one a healthy sense of fear, and the second one a sinful sense of fear. A healthy sense of fear. This is the feeling of concern about a particular situation that is really hazardous. All right? This neutral emotion acts as the soul's warning system, alerting you to a real threat. At this point, depending upon how one responds, that's not sin. It may just be wisdom. Perfect example of this is a situation in the Old Testament, particularly in the law code, the Mosaic law code. You see, out of love for neighbor, God commanded that homeowners, under the Old Covenant law, the Israelites, construct a parapet, that is a balcony, around the second story roof of their houses, which were frequently used for additional rooms. The idea was that there was a significantly higher level of risk, danger, to a person seriously hurting oneself the higher up from the ground one ascends. This concern, this anxiety, leads to a reasonable action. Build a railing, because the threat is real. And that kind of fear, that kind of anxiety, that kind of concern is healthy, even necessary in a world gone fallen. So that's an example of a healthy fear, a healthy anxiety. But let's look at what a sinful worry or sinful fear is. A sinful fear can be described as an over preoccupation with a genuine concern that you either have no control over or that is based upon speculative future events. I'm going to read that again. A sinful fear can be described as an over preoccupation with, just like grinding this thing all the time. An over preoccupation with a genuine concern, but you don't have any control over changing it, or it is based upon the future events, speculative events that, again, you have no control over. You are worried or fretful about a situation that you have no power over. Or it is an imaginative future concern, and both forms of this are sinful. A perfect example of this is the famous teaching in Matthew chapter 6. You'll clearly, right off the bat, identify these words. Jesus said, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, nor about the body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow." Do not be anxious about tomorrow, the future. Don't be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will have enough anxiety for itself. Tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Don't try and deal with tomorrow's trouble today. That is anxiety. That is sinful worry. That is sinful fear. So, legitimate concern, which is fixated on unpredictable or uncontrollable future events, grows and becomes sinful because of that. You're fixated on it, and you can't control it, and you have no power over it. It's a phantom. That's it That is, you are erecting a doomful scenario in your mind that's not real. It's a phantom. And that is what the Bible describes as a sinful form of fear that I think we generally describe as anxiety. So in the Bible, you have healthy fear and an unhealthy sinful fear. And so the question that remains is, what do I do with unhealthy sinful fear? How do I fight the temptation to become so over preoccupied with the dangers or the threats that my soul's warning system is actually malfunctioning? How do I fight the temptation? I said that wrong. How do I fight the temptation to become so over preoccupied with the dangers so that my soul's warning system is not malfunctioning? Well, that's what you're going to have to come back next week for. But in the meantime, let me leave you with these words from the book of Psalms. Psalm chapter 118, verses 5 and 6. And I think you'll see this as applicable for today. The psalmist says, "Out of my distress, I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free." He wants that for you. He wants that for me. But the threat was real. The distress was real. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. For what can man do to me? Notice the progression there. Out of my distress, a real threat is there. Danger, warning, warning, warning. You notice that God is on your side. Even though you can't control the future, He is taking care of you. You have decided, you have determined, I will not fear. For what can man do to me? So are there real threats in the world? At this time especially, yes. And does the Bible give us a battle plan as to how to address those fears so that we might be able to experience a kind of peace and freedom that surpasses all understanding? Absolutely. But you'll have to come back next week in order to get those truths. All right, so hopefully this has been helpful. Remember, if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to text or call me or email Pastor Monty. And until next time, may the Lord bless you. May He shine His countenance upon you, and may He give you peace. Take care. God bless.